let's go to Vinoo Varghese, who is a criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor. And Vinoo, I may interrupt you when we get word of a verdict here, but what's your sense of things?
Really, really quick, especially after a 5-week trial. I think it goes to show you, or tells me, that these jurors want to get out because there's so much evidence, so much to consider. The jury instructions are quite complicated. So it leads me to believe that they've already made their decision. Most of them had made their decision. It seems like one was holding out, and they probably got that holdout to come over to their way. The way that I see it is that objectively, he's not guilty of RICO. He's not guilty of sex trafficking, but he's guilty of the prostitution charges. But in a case like this, when the government throws so much out at you, he's probably been found guilty of all charges.
All right, let me interrupt you here because we are getting word of what the verdicts are. Count 1, racketeering, not guilty. Count 2, sex trafficking, not guilty. Count 3, Mann Act transportation. That's guilty. Count 4, sex trafficking, not guilty. Count 5, again, Mann Act transportation. That is guilty. So you've got 2 guilties and 3 not guilties. The Mann Act, so you know, is transporting somebody across state lines for purposes of sex or prostitution. So let me go around the horn and ask everybody their reaction to this. Vinoo, what do you think?
Well, it's what I just predicted. He put me on the spot, and I said objectively, he's guilty of the 2 prostitution counts, not guilty of RICO, and not guilty of the sex trafficking. I mean, I think those were ridiculous charges to begin with, to just pile on. I mean, the reality is, did he bring people across state lines for prostitution and sex? Yes, and he paid them. So, you know, he's guilty. I'm actually impressed that the jury was able to see through all of that and come to what I think is a proper verdict. Now, the larger question is, should promoting prostitution be illegal, the world's oldest profession? Well, that's a question for another day, and perhaps one for appeal.
Nicole Parker, your thoughts?
I have to tell you that I actually am surprised. I am surprised that it was not guilty on the sex trafficking charges. Obviously, the prostitution, the Mann Act charges, those were very easy to prove, very evident, very obvious. Again, the RICO, I think that we all agree that that was going to be very difficult for them to charge. But to me, it is surprising that neither of the sex trafficking counts, neither of them stuck, and, you know, acquittals on those. That's surprising to me.
Derrick, your thoughts?
I'm not surprised. The racketeering and the sex trafficking, I always had problems with that. The Mann Act, like you said about the prostitution, I had a problem that he might get convicted of that, but I wasn't surprised about the racketeering and the sex trafficking. I didn't think that was something that he would be convicted on, and so the jury saw through that, and they made the decision.
All right, just to repeat, Sean Diddy Combs found guilty on the Mann Act violations, which is essentially prostitution across state lines, not guilty on the racketeering conspiracy charge, which was highly complicated, as well as the 2 sex trafficking charges, not guilty. So not guilty on 3, guilty on 2. But as I read the statutes on sentencing and punishment, the most severe was actually the sex trafficking, which had a minimum of 15 years behind bars. The racketeering, surprisingly, was a more malleable sentencing structure, literally 0 to, you know, add-ons to life. But it depended on the predicate crimes that the jury would find. But all of that is thrown out the window, both the racketeering and the sex trafficking. And Vinoo, I tend to think that the Mann Act violations are a lot less in terms of punishment. I mean, he could go anywhere from, I think, probation to, a year or two. What are your thoughts?
Well, I don't see the judge not giving him some jail time. I think that this judge, so there's some important things to know about this judge. He's new to the bench. He's a Biden appointee, so he was appointed within the last couple of years. He doesn't come from a criminal justice background, meaning he was not a prosecutor. He was not a public defender. So, but he's ambitious. He wants to get to the Second Circuit. And unfortunately, the way that it works, and this is going to hurt Diddy, is that these guys, these judges, regardless of background, most of them don't want to upset the U.S. Attorney's Office and don't want to appear to be somebody who's not going to punish someone severely. So he's looking at some time, I would say at least 5 years. And the other thing is that this judge can consider charges for which he was acquitted and say, you know what, the jury ruled this way, but I think, you know what, you were really guilty of all this stuff, and enhance his sentence. It's called relevant conduct under the federal system. All of this doesn't spell well. It would not surprise me if he gets a sentence over 10 years. And I think that's the judge is going to do that, and then he's going to let the appellate court decide whether that sentence was unreasonable or not.
Really? Over 10 years?
Yes, I can see that. Particularly, I know the judge, from a tangential social level. I've not appeared before him because he's been a new judge. So I think that he's going to give at least a 10-year sentence.
All right. Nicole, what about that? People tend to think of violations of the Mann Act, transporting an individual for purposes of sex across state line, to be, somewhat antiquated. I don't want to say minor, but it's one of those things that doesn't seem to get at the top of the list of prosecutions in most cases. But here, I think the evidence was so blatantly obvious that that's what Combs was doing on a routine basis. That certainly was the easy one. What do you think?
I agree with you. I mean, the evidence was overwhelming. It was, it was a slam dunk for them on those counts. Again, I'm surprised by the possibility of a 10-year sentence. I actually think that sounds rather high for the Mann Act and for prostitution. But again, considering all of the evidence that was seen by this judge, and like was mentioned, it is a new judge. They want to prove that, they do take things seriously. And again, I think for me personally, this entire investigation, in light of what happened with Epstein, I, reside in the Southern District of Florida, where the Epstein case originated. He got a slap on the wrist, ended up getting charged by the Southern District of New York. And I think in light of that big investigation and how it wasn't handled properly, I think they wanted to take no chances of, if this is a possibility of sex trafficking, we need to take it seriously. Let's do the full-blown investigation. No celebrity, no one with money and power should get away with anything just because they have money and power. And so that's kind of how I saw this investigation from the beginning. Of course, everyone should be treated fairly under the court of law. It is, regardless of how much money you have. I think that they wanted to set a precedence, though, that just because you have money and power, successful enterprises does not permit you to violating the law. And so I do think it's interesting that a 10-year sentence for the Mann Act for prostitution, to me, that does seem high. But let's see what the judge comes up with. Yeah. Obviously, they look at the sentencing guidelines, and they'll do what they think is appropriate for the charges.
All right, let me bring into this conversation Eric Seidel, who is a former federal prosecutor. And, Eric, thanks for taking a few moments. So, not guilty on 3 counts. The sex trafficking, I think, based on the level of sentencing and punishment, was the most serious, because that carried a minimum of 15, and you got 2 of those. If they ran consecutively, could have been 30 years. The racketeering, that when you actually look at the statute, depends on the predicate crimes, but it's not not really quite as serious in terms of punishment. What about these two convictions on the Mann Act, again, transferring across state lines for purposes of sex? What's your reaction to this?
Well, you know, I think the prostitution part, the transferring across state lines, also related to the male prostitutes or males that were brought in to have sex with whoever.
Yes.
And it seems to me that the jury brought the consent offense with the women. So that's something I looked at. And, you know, there are other issues out there, too. For instance, is he going to be kept in pending appeal and be released on bail because, you know, he wasn't convicted of the most serious counts? Then there's the issue of forfeiture. Being called for forfeiture if he was convicted of RICO. Well, he wasn't convicted of RICO. So it looks like he probably skates on that one as well. But again, my takeaway overall is that the jury did not believe the women were coerced.
Yeah, and, you know, Eric, that was the defense all along. In the closing arguments, they all but said, look, our client is a bad guy, but, and we own, you know, his beating of his girlfriend captured on videotape, but they essentially said, forget all of that. Everything else in the case was consensual. So in other words, it wasn't forcible sex and sex trafficking. It didn't constitute racketeering because all of the activities that were recounted by prosecutors were all consensual and not coerced or forced through bribery or threats or, you know, blackmail. You know, that seemed almost like a preposterous defense, but, you know, for three of the counts, it worked, didn't it?
It did. It did. And as I say, that was my takeaway. The jury accepted the defense and rejected the prosecution's argument that there was coercion.
You know, we were talking a moment ago. How much time do you think Combs will get on the two Mann Act violations?
You know, I don't know. You know, there's a statutory requirement, and you know, the judge can consider, as was pointed out, conduct for which he was acquitted. I mean, he'll get a good number of years, but it clearly pales in comparison to what he could have gotten had he been convicted of the RICO or the sex trafficking.
Yeah, let me bring back into the conversation Derrick Parker. You know, Derrick, looking at these two guilty verdicts, three not guilty verdicts, you know, it's tempting to say that prosecutors overplayed their hand and overtried the case. But, I mean, everybody knows, and I handled a racketeering case long ago, everybody knows that it is so complicated that it is exceedingly difficult to convince a jury to even get them to understand it. And of course, we saw they had some problems with the jury instructions on racketeering. You know, a simple question. Why not just go after him on the underlying crimes, the arson, the blackmail, you know, all of the various, and that videotape of him beating his then girlfriend, Cassie Ventura, which was so horrific and monstrous, a savage beating. Why not just go for those crimes?
Well, in my opinion, the government didn't have, those charges were never charged about the beating. But I don't think the government had enough to go on those and couldn't prove them. That's why they dropped those cases, the arson and the Kid Cudi and some other charges that they decided to dismiss before the deliberations went in. So I think that they like you said, I think the outcry was, even with the public and everyone else, that this was far-reaching a little bit. But I'm not surprised on the other two charges of the Mann Act, because that was probably a given that he was going to be charged with that. But there's a lot of people in the public eye who feel that this case still should have been a state case and it should have not got to the federal government because it was brought there because of who he was and because of the lawsuits that triggered a lot of the stuff and that video. Everything just made it that more sensational that the government had to step in.
Yeah. What about that, Vinoo Varghese? Should this have been tried in state court instead of federal court? And might the case have been brought far more simply than the complicated racketeering and so forth?
Well, without that RICO charge, most of these are state court acts, and the federal government wouldn't have had jurisdiction over those acts that were listed as one of the 10 acts. So, look, the federal government picks and chooses its cases, particularly in Manhattan and the Southern District of New York. And they decided, hey, we're going to get this guy. And the way the DOJ works, and there's been so much talk about this over the years of how politicized the DOJ is. This is example A of how political this is, which is, pandering to the public or the public outcry to get this guy because he's a bad guy. And that's what this case was about. They're like, okay, we're going to get him. We're going to throw everything at him. I'm actually surprised, even though I predicted objectively that those were the only two counts he should be convicted of. I'm actually surprised because the reality is that in federal court, and the reason the conviction rate is so high is because lawyers can't pick a jury. The judges pick the jury. And a person can say 4 times in a row, well, I'm not sure I can be fair. But if on the 5th time and after repeated badgering by the guy standing way up high and going, hey, if I tell you to be fair and impartial, it's magically fair and impartial. So, I'm actually really pleasantly surprised that the jury came back in this case, especially a case of this nature. Look, I've had wins in federal court, but they weren't as sensationalized as this case. And, good for them.
Yeah, Eric Seidel, if you're still there, let me go back to you about this forfeiture. So the government can seek under certain circumstances upon conviction forfeiture of assets of the convicted defendant. Does that really apply for Mann Act violations?
I'm not sure about that. I don't think so, but I'm not sure about that. I know it's mandatory with a RICO conviction. And there would be a hearing after the conviction, after the trial, to determine how much money should be taken by the government. But I don't know as far as the Mann Act, but I don't think so.
Yeah. Vinoo, do you know, as a lawyer, you were former prosecutor, criminal defense attorney currently. I agree with Eric that absolutely there's forfeiture under racketeering. I'm not sure there is under the Mann Act. Do you know?
Yeah, there will be. Look, the government's going to try to wrest his fortune from him because this is a huge loss for the federal government, right? Now, they're going to sit pretty in the sense that this judge is likely to give him what I think is probably 10 years, which is the max, and run the 2 sentences concurrently. I think that's probably what this judge is going to do to make a statement that he himself is tough on crime. And the government's going to try to take away as much of Diddy's money as possible. So, yeah, they can seek forfeiture basically under any crime. So the question is, how much is it going to be? And I imagine, Diddy's going to fight, and they're going to have a tough time showing that the money that he made or whatever, that, in reality, the defense is going to be they didn't make any money. This was for his own personal pleasure. And I think that may carry the day even under forfeiture.
Well, reading the indictment, clearly there's forfeiture under count 1, which he was acquitted of. The government wants to have forfeiture under count 2. and count 3. But those are the only counts that they're asking for forfeiture under.
Yeah, I'm not sure there's much precedent for forfeiture under the Mann Act, but it could be discretionary depending upon what the judge determines in fines. Nicole Parker, back to you. Did the government go overboard here?
Well, some obviously believe they did. Others, do not. I personally, I think that they brought a worthy case. I think that it was aggressive. I don't know if people realize, but it was actually Jim Comey's daughter that was on the prosecution team for this investigation in this case, which, is interesting in and of itself. But yeah, I think that, again, having worked sex trafficking cases in a different district, it really does come down to how aggressive your prosecutors are. What kind of evidence do you think that you have? But I am very surprised at this outcome. I'm actually surprised that the jurors were not certain about the RICO charge, but were certain about not guilty on the sex trafficking. I would have thought that it would have been RICO that they would have come in and said not guilty, but the fact that they had to go back and do more deliberations. But again, I respect, but I agree that if the government's going to bring a case, you've got to have everything buttoned up and you've got to have it ready to go. And I think that they just assumed that they did have the evidence. I think the defense did a very good job. They really did. They convinced the jurors that, these women, they were, in agreement with some of these things. They showed the text messages, things that showed, hey, not exactly that they were forced or coerced into some of these activities. But on the flip side, I think that the abuse, I think it's irrefutable. There was major abuse. There was major issues going on. But again, the defense painted the picture that that's not what this case is about. That's not what RICO's about. That's not what sex trafficking is about. But I do think that it was brought on federally because a lot of these allegations, they did cross state lines. And so I think that they said, rather than charging it in the state, it involved Miami, Los Angeles, New York, interstate commerce. And so they did. They came in heavy with those federal charges. Again, it all comes down to the jury. It always comes down to the jury and jury selection. Regardless of what evidence you have, it is the temperature of the jury. And I am surprised. Like I said, I might be the only person on this panel that's surprised by the outcome of all of these counts. Again, the sex trafficking, that's probably the one I'm most surprised about. The RICO, I'm not surprised that it was not guilty. But, they thought that they had a good, worthy case. And again, I still believe that the ramifications of the Epstein debacle, I think that they're trying to come in heavy on these types of allegations to prove to Americans that sex trafficking, things of that nature, will not be permitted regardless of how powerful you are in this country. And you know what? They came back and it's not guilty. And that's it.
Eric Seidel, let me go back to you on a point of law. So people may be scratching their heads and saying, wait a minute, he's guilty on the prostitution, transportation, but not guilty on sex trafficking. That may strike people as inconsistent. How can you be guilty of prostitution across state lines but not sex trafficking?
That's I suppose, the beauty of the jury system. You can't really get in there and figure out exactly what they were deliberating about. But, this is not an inconsistent verdict legally. And that's what they decided. To explain it, I can't, but I'm pretty sure it's not inconsistent legally. So it's going to stand up on appeal on if they challenge it on that basis.
Yeah, Vinoo, what about that? There are differences technically under the law, and if you look at the jury instruction, there are difference of findings of fact and law between sex trafficking and the prostitution charges. Is that a distinction without a difference or meaningful?
Well, I agree with Eric that the defense that it's not inconsistent. Meaning, look, sex trafficking involves the use of fraud, force, or coercion. So the jury clearly found that these girls were not induced by fraud. by force and they weren't coerced. So that's why they found not guilty of the sex trafficking. I think that's painfully clear, should have been painfully clear to anyone who watched this trial. These women or some of the men were not forced, they got paid. There was no fraud, force, or coercion there. The question is, of how much time he's going to get for the prostitution, because he clearly was paying people, crossing state lines, having these kind of parties, and these freak offs and baby oil and everything else that has produced endless memes on the internet and cartoons, which are actually quite funny, about Diddy and all this stuff. So I think this judge is just probably very irritated. He wants to ingratiate himself to the federal prosecutors who have a big say in whether this guy will one day sit on the Second Circuit, the appellate court that is right over the Southern District of New York. So he's going to send a message to Diddy, and my prediction is 10 years run concurrently on those two charges.
Derrick, Parker, let me go back to you. You knew Combs professionally, arrested him twice in 1999, former NYPD detective. And you know the hip-hop world, the rap world. I mean, how much celebrity do you think might have influenced the jury?
Oh, it definitely influenced the jury. I mean, listen, look how sensational this case is right now. This is one of the biggest names in hip hop. So it definitely was something very big. If you notice, there was a case in the Eastern District involving Abercrombie and Fitch, the CEOs. You hear nothing really about that case. You might have heard maybe one or two stories about it, but you don't hear anything more about it. And that case was in the same line as sex trafficking and prostitution. And you really don't hear much about it. So, yes, when it comes to Diddy, he was more popular than anybody else in the world. He was hobnobbing with the rich and famous, and that's who he was,
So, Eric Seidel, it's not over for Diddy. He is looking potentially at time behind bars. He'll appeal. That's obviously an ongoing legal expense. And he's facing a plethora of civil lawsuits for money damages from many of the people whose names were mentioned during the course of this trial. They say they were victims of, his sex trafficking, his coercion, his blackmail. So, I mean, this is a guy who's not only looking at time behind bars, but he's looking at a substantial loss of his fortune, don't you think?
Yeah, it's going to be about money largely from now on. And, in these civil cases, it's, obvious, everybody knows it, or everybody on the panel, the standard of proof is lower. It's preponderance of the evidence, in other words, 50% plus. And a criminal case is beyond a reasonable doubt, which is a much higher standard. So civil plaintiffs have an easier burden. And look, the first thing for Combs is going to be, does he get out pending appeal? Does he get out today? Is bail going to be set because he was acquitted of the most serious charges? And I think that's something that's going to play out. His lawyer's going to argue that he should get bail, that he can make, and the government probably is going to oppose it. So that's really step one. And then, of course, there's sentencing.
Yeah, and so the grounds for bail here, among the considerations, the judge would decide, is he a flight risk? Is he a danger to the community? Does he have ties to the community? I mean, I think ties to the community is obvious. Danger to the community, I would tend to think not, given what's happened. A flight risk, you can always take away, his passport and restrict him, or you could even put him under, house detention. What are your thoughts about that? You think he would actually get it?
I think he's got a good shot at getting some kind of bail or house detention. But it's not something that's certain. The judge could say, look, you're facing serious jail time. You've got a good, big incentive to flee. You've got a big incentive to hide your money, which you can do easier if you were out rather than being in. So it's going to be an argument. And I would doubt that the government would consent to a bail that would let him out. Although they might, who knows what they're thinking at this point, beyond being disappointed. So that's the next step that probably will take place, either today or in the coming days.
Yeah, Vinoo, as a lawyer, what do you think of the likelihoods of bail at this point?
I don't think this judge is going to give him bail. I think this judge is going to sentence him to jail, even though there's no mandatory minimum on the prostitution charges. I think that I would be shocked if the judge actually released him on bail. Now, that being said, his lawyers can then go to the appellate court, which is right next door, and make a motion for bail pending appeal. But the issue then is, will he be able to show a likelihood of success on the merits? Meaning, he's got to convince the appellate court that he's going to win on the two remaining charges. And I don't think he's going to win on the two remaining charges, because I think it's clear that he engaged in prostitution or promoting prostitution across state lines. So I think he's in a tough spot and will continue to be in the MDC. I have a client who's in the same wing with him, and so I've seen Diddy in the MDC in that particular protected wing, because my client had a high-profile case, and he was always a gentleman.
Yeah, the cheering you're hearing. Let me just interrupt. The family of Sean Combs just emerged from the courthouse in Manhattan, and you saw his mother, who was sort of leading the way, and I believe some of his children, other relatives. They've been a constant presence inside the courtroom, supporting him throughout. And there they are getting into the van, which has been fairly familiar, coming to and from the courthouse. So, yeah, they're loading into the van. They've got to feel that this is at least a partial victory, maybe a substantial victory, beating the rap of the most serious of the five charges, not guilty on three of them, guilty on two of them. And so we continue. I mean, he has quite a few grown children who've been there throughout the trial. And, it had to be exceedingly difficult for relatives to sit in the courtroom and look at the video of the beating by Combs, of his then girlfriend, kicking her, pummeling her, dragging her by her neck and by her hair. It's pretty vivid, pretty gruesome, pretty awful. And then, of course, all of the intimate testimony of these, what are known as, at least he called them, freak-offs, sexual extravaganzas with baby oil, and they would go on and on for hours and hours, and they'd be videotaped. Now, the videotape of those were not played in open court, but jurors were shown it privately, not all of it, becoming, you're talking about endless hours of it over the course of, many different days and weeks, and it went on for a long time. But it had to be, it had to be difficult for the family of Sean Combs, and, one wonders what's going through their minds as they're sitting in the courtroom and they're listening to Cassie Ventura and other women take the witness stand one after another, saying, he beat me, he coerced me, he threatened me. One woman claimed that Combs dangled her over the balcony of a hotel, I don't know, 14, 17 stories up. If you're a family member sitting there listening to this, you either have to think these people are terrible liars, or, I'm uncomfortable with what my son or father did here, but they stuck by him nevertheless. That was rather odd. Some people got out of the black van and moved over to another different van. Maybe there's a limit on vans. Derrick Parker, let me go back to you. This guy was such a celebrity at one point in time. He would hold these mega parties out, in the Hamptons and elsewhere. A who's who of people in entertainment would flock to these parties. I think that may be over for Diddy. Do you think?
Yeah, I would have to say he's not going to probably do any more of those parties. As to look what just happened. But I can say this: when he had his parties, he had some of the biggest parties in the world that people wanted to attend. I mean, look at the A-list celebrities that attended his parties. I know for a fact, when I was out working and retired, we had to deal with some of his parties and things like that. So I know firsthand that, he ran a tight ship when it came to those parties, but he did have a lot of entertainers and celebrities. But again, he probably would stay away from that now, as being all this that happened in this case. I wouldn't do another party at all.
Yeah, Nicole Parker, I wonder how long the FBI was on to Combs, initially surreptitiously sort of examining his finances, maybe talking to people quietly. How do you think they got onto him?
Well, Homeland Security investigations were the lead federal agency in this investigation. And I think that a lot of times it does stem from those civil lawsuits that come forward. A lot of times, individuals with high powered attorneys come into these federal agencies. And a lot of times our investigations do stem from civil lawsuits that can turn into federal criminal investigations and cases. And I certainly think that's what happened here. And again, a lot of this case was downplayed. These are just money grabs. These are just women that want money. Look, they got all of this money. He settled for money. And that's the difference between the civil side and the criminal side. You can silence someone with money on the civil side and say, look, we'll pay you this amount of money, just please go away. But on the criminal side, that doesn't work. And so I think that the federal government thought that they had a very strong case through HSI and other, investigative agencies that provided assistance. And in the end, they just did not. But I think that it probably started that way. And they dug into it. They built off of what the attorneys brought to them, probably for Cassie Ventura and others that, came forward with those civil lawsuits. They came to the feds, and, HSI is very well known for investigating sex trafficking, human trafficking, labor trafficking, all of those sorts of allegations. And I think that they did. They took it heavy, they took it strong, and they said, we're going to charge him criminally on top of all of this money that he's already paying out to these individuals. And it just didn't play out well for them. That the federal government, I'm sorry, but this was a failure for them. I think that when you bring on a case with 5 counts and all you could walk away with are convictions on 2 of the counts, that is not a success. That is not a success for them. And again, it all comes down to the jury.
Let's listen in right now to what's going on.
Incarceration. So thank you very much. Thank you.
Well, I apologize. We didn't exactly get to hear what was said there. Looked to me like a federal prosecutor.
That was Wig
but I
Gore,
can't
who
say for
represents
sure.
some of the people suing him.
Thank you.
He's
All
one
right,
of the biggest
so we were
plaintiffs'
talking
attorneys
about-
in New York.
We were talking a moment ago about the amount of money in the civil lawsuits that that's sort of, Eric, isn't that sort of a double-edged sword? Because, it's fodder for the defense on cross-examination to say, Ms. Ventura, aren't you driven by greed? You sued him. All you wanted was money. So you have a motive to lie. That's a typical defense cross-ex tactic, isn't it?
Absolutely. And, I would guess that to a certain extent it worked in this case. To impeach her credibility, to say, look, you stuck with them, you came back for more, you're looking for money. That absolutely would have been part of the cross-examination.
And, Vinoo, I'm always skeptical of those kinds of lawsuits because once Cassie Ventura filed hers, all of a sudden there was this avalanche or cascade of other almost identical, lawsuits. And not all, I would imagine, are completely meritorious. Some might be. But, you're making it harder for prosecutors in a criminal case, right?
Certainly are.
Sure.
And, things have to be given. Positions are often given. And, often what we would do where there's a prospect of a civil suit, we'd ask them to hold off, until we finish the criminal case. Another thing that's probably going to happen if the civil case goes to trial, which is probably not likely, but Combs would have to testify, and be deposed. So that could be interesting if it ever gets that far, which it probably wouldn't, but if it ever does.
Yeah. Well, it is. It's been an incredible morning, dramatic turn of events. Yesterday, at the end of the day, the jurors were, unalterably opposed and couldn't decide unanimously. And all of a sudden today, within an hour, oops, never mind, we have decided unanimously. And of course, that was on count number one, which was the racketeering case, not guilty. The others, they decided unanimously in the course of about a day and a half and reached a decision yesterday. And, of course, on the sex trafficking, not guilty, not guilty. On the prostitution involving transporting people across state lines for purposes of prostitution, that 2 counts guilty. The racketeering conspiracy, Eric, as I looked at that racketeering case, he was the only defendant, and yet it's a conspiracy. And do you think that might have bothered the jurors?
I don't know that necessarily bothered them. I mean, really, what you have to prove in a racketeering, in a RICO conspiracy, is an agreement to be part of, the enterprise that's going to commit the racketeering act. You don't even have to do anything. You just have to agree. And it's a great charge for prosecutors. But look, I think the heart of this is that the jury rejected the women as victims. They were probably felt a little sorry for them, one got beaten up, but they did not think that they were coerced. And I tend to think that really is the heart of what they were deciding. They just did not accept that they were forced to do this. That, it might have been reprehensible. It might not have been something that they would have done. But they saw these women, they stuck with Combs, for whatever reason, career, love, who knows what. But they weren't forced. And I think that really was the heart of the decision.
Yeah, and Eric, racketeering people associate with organized crime, mobsters, mafia, and so forth. And that's how it was originally designed as a valuable new tool by the federal government to go after, organized crime, the traditional mafia, and it was used effectively. But if you're a juror in New York City and you go, well, that guy's not a mobster. This guy's not mafia. How is this racketeering? Because of the popular impression of what racketeering is. Might that have bothered them?
Maybe, but the judge would have instructed them, and the indictment spelled out what the enterprise was, and even though it wasn't, this wasn't a mafia case, and you're right, RICO was designed initially to combat organized crime, which at the time was the mafia, but it's developed over the past 50 years. To apply to other enterprises. And, they're all defined in the statute, an association is fact and all that kind of stuff. And the judge will explain what that means and the indictment will spell it out. And this indictment was pretty specific. It spelled out, it described what the enterprise was. So I don't know that was necessarily the sticking point. Again, I come back to it. My sense of the sticking point was the conduct of the women and whether or not they were coerced or they agreed for whatever reason, twisted or not, to participate in whatever he was doing. So I don't know that it wasn't because it was a mafia case that they had a problem with it.
Yeah. Vinoo, we're waiting right now for maybe a news conference. It may or may not occur. Typically, the media will set up and make a space available if prosecutors want to come out and talk, if defense attorneys want to come out and talk. How would you handicap? If I'm the prosecution, I might be of two minds. Well, we got to get out front of this and, put lipstick on the pig of our failure. Or they might decide that, gee, we pretty much lost, so we're going to keep our mouths shut. What do you think?
I think they're going to put lipstick on the pig, as you just said. I think they're going to come out and say, look, we disagree with the jury's verdict on this. We believe the guilt was overwhelming, but we respect the jury verdict. This is how they're taught to speak, as all prosecutors are taught to speak. But they'll say, look, he's still convicted of this. He should get, we're going to ask for 10 years. They may ask for 20 to have the sentences run consecutive. And, they may do that and then put it in the judge's lap to see how much he gives them. I think if you're all in, these guys are all in, right? And so they want to save face. They're probably going to ask for 20 to have the two charges run consecutively. And they may not say that today, but that's what's going to be in their sentencing memorandum.
Yeah. Now, the judge has not yet decided if Combs will be released pending sentencing. Vinoo, I think you had already expressed that you didn't think that would ever happen. And Eric, if you're a judge and you're sitting on the bench here, you might say to yourself, well, what's wrong with house arrest pending appeal? Do you think it's a close call or an easy one to say, sorry, bail denied?
I don't think it's an easy call. I at least not an easy one for me to what the judge would do. I think there are good arguments on both sides. I think both sides are going to make them, and I think that's what's next on the agenda. where the defense is going to say, hey, release my guy. It's true, he's facing jail time, but he was acquitted of the most serious charges. And he's coming back. He's not going anywhere. And we'll give you all these assurances, loads of money, 24/7 people to guard him, ankle bracelets, wrist bracelets, neck bracelets, whatever you want. And, I couldn't tell you right now what the judge is going to do. And, as pointed out before, there's always an appeal depending on what he decides. But I think there are good arguments on both sides at this point.
All right, we've been watching a bit of a verbal confrontation between a couple of people there. A little bit of yelling and screaming. Can't really tell what it's about. Let's just listen in for a sec.
It's over. I'm done. She could have just this is your freedom. Use your cell phone. Use your cell phone. Use your cell phone. You don't want this house. You don't want this house. Let Puffy go. Let Puffy go. Let Puffy go. Let Puffy go. Let Puffy go.
All right, we've been listening to a shouting match. I've spent a few decades in and out of courthouses as a journalist and as a lawyer, and you always have crowds, especially in celebrated cases, that just want to be there and act up. And I'll ask my panel, do you have any idea what that was all about, or is it just people acting crazy for the sake of it? Anybody?
Couldn't understand a thing.
Well, he was just saying, let Puffy go. That guy in the yellow there. So I think he was just looking to get, his minute of fame on camera. Somebody's recording him. He probably didn't know Fox Nation's recording him, but if any of his friends see him, this will be a nice clip for him.
All right. The defense has asked the judge on this issue of whether or not there should be a release pending sentencing, which wouldn't take, sentencing would maybe be a couple of months down the line. They got to do a interview, probation report, both sides submit their briefs and so forth. And then, a sentencing date is set. So should he be released pending that or not? And the judge said he'll make a decision after the sides submit formal arguments at 1 p.m. Eastern. So we're looking at a couple of hours from now, and that could stretch well into the afternoon. I want to say thanks to our guests, Eric Seidel, Vinoo Varghese, Nicole Parker, Derrick Parker. You all have been great providing terrific insight and analysis, so many thanks for being with us. To wrap up, the trial of Sean Combs, P. Diddy, other AKAs, acquitted on 3 of the 5 charges, found guilty of 2 of, I think we can agree, or sort of the lesser charges, the prostitution charges. But, as Vinoo had pointed out, he could do up to 10 years, maybe more. We'll wait and see what happens. Thank you for being here. That's it for now. This has been a Fox Nation special. And we will also be back at 1 o'clock Eastern Time because in Idaho, the Kohlberger case, there will be a change of plea from not guilty to guilty. It's a plea agreement between the prosecutors to take the death penalty off the table if Kohlberger would agree to plead guilty. So we'll have coverage of that beginning at 1 o'clock Eastern Time right here on Fox Nation. Thanks for being here. See you in a couple of hours.